He was a king, by blood, by birth, by divine right. But he could not speak until the age of 4, could not walk until the age of 8, and could not eat without assistance for most of his short, tormented life. Charles II of Spain came into the world not as a man, but as a warning. A final exhalation of the great Habsburg dynasty. His body bore the grotesque signatures of generations of inbreeding. Jaw so deformed he could barely chew, tongue so oversized he could hardly be understood, mind clouded by illness, soul rumored to be cursed. His courtiers whispered of black magic. Priests tried to exorcise demons from him. But there were no demons, only chromosomes, damaged by centuries of power hoarded through incest. To the world, he was El Hechizado, the bewitched. But the real curse was not cast by witches or rival thrones. It was written into his veins, etched in the family tree that spiraled tighter with every royal marriage. Charles II was not simply a man. He was a mirror held up to the dark heart of empire, a living autopsy of a dynasty that had chosen bloodline over sanity, and in doing so had sealed its own decay. In the grand palaces of Europe, love was never part of the wedding vows. Royalty married not for desire, not even for companionship, but for borders, treaties, and blood, always the blood. By the 17th century, the great houses of Europe had entangled themselves in a web of dynastic ambition so dense that the difference between a wedding and a family reunion became academic. The Habsburgs, more than any other royal house, mastered this game of matrimonial chess, though in the end, it was a game they played against themselves. The Habsburgs of Spain believed in keeping their empire pure, pure in blood, pure in lineage, pure in the sacred right to rule. But purity is a dangerous fantasy when biology is not invited to the table. Their answer to the threat of dilution was incest, cloaked in the fine robes of political necessity. Brother married sister, uncle took niece, cousins married cousins for generations, as if power could be preserved in a bottle, passed down unchanged. The result was not purity, but a slow collapse from within, one malformed heir at a time. Charles II was not an accident. He was a blueprint fulfilled. His father, Philip IV of Spain, had married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. That made Charles both son and great-nephew to the same man. His grandparents, too, had been first cousins. The Habsburg family tree didn't branch, it coiled inward, like a snake devouring itself. By the time Charles was born in 1661, the genetic load was no longer theoretical. It had a face, a name, and a crumbling throne. He was born on a cold November day in 1661, weeks earlier than expected, tiny and frail, barely able to cry. The royal midwives who attended his birth in the Escorial Palace held their breath not in joy, but in dread. Something was wrong. Not obviously, there were no missing limbs, no grotesque deformities visible to the naked eye, but there was a sense, unmistakable to those who had seen many births, that this child was not ready for the world. And more hauntingly, that the world might not be ready for him. Charles II of Spain came into life like a dying ember, weak, flickering, and cold. From his earliest moments, his body betrayed him. He could not nurse properly. He did not gain weight. He cried incessantly, not in hunger or pain, but as if simply being alive was unbearable. At an age when most noble children were already speaking their first words, Charles remained silent. He did not speak until he was nearly 4 years old. He did not walk unaided until he was 8. And even then, his steps were awkward, stumbling, guided by the hands of attendants who followed him day and night like shadows. His digestive system was a mystery to his physicians, a bottomless source of concern and confusion. Charles could not eat solid food like other children. Even as a teenager, his meals were often mashed into pastes or broths. He suffered chronic diarrhea and bloating, his body unable to extract nourishment efficiently. A simple illness could leave him bedridden for weeks. Sometimes, he could not relieve himself without help. Servants assisted him with defecation, dressing, bathing, and even chewing. The most basic functions of living had to be borrowed from others. Then there was the face. the infamous face. The lower jaw jutted forward so grotesquely that he could not close his mouth completely. His tongue, thick and oversized, sat like a swollen parasite behind misshapen teeth. Speech was slurred, nearly incomprehensible, and required immense effort. Eating was not just difficult. It was a struggle between body and will, performed daily with the dignity of a man who knew everyone was watching. The so-called Habsburg jaw, long a signature of his dynasty's inbreeding, had reached its final catastrophic expression in Charles. It had moved beyond peculiarity and become a grotesque monument to genetic collapse. And yet he lived. That, perhaps, was the most extraordinary thing about Charles II. Despite a body that should have failed him entirely, he survived into adulthood 38 long, humiliating, painful years. But survival is not the same as life. His days were filled with suffering that he could never name, with a consciousness likely aware of its own imprisonment. For if Charles's body was broken, his soul was still there, aware, alert, confused, perhaps afraid. He was no fool, contrary to the cruel portraits often painted of him. He was slow, yes. Learning came with great difficulty. But he was not ignorant. He understood enough to know that he was different, that others whispered, that he was feared, and fear, more than anything, defined how people saw him. His disabilities, coupled with the profound religious superstition of the era, made him an object of both pity and dread. Rumors spread that Charles was cursed, that he had been bewitched in the womb, that sorcery had drained his vitality. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, not metaphorically, literally. They believed his body was under the control of demons. Priests were summoned to perform exorcisms. Holy water was sprinkled across his bed. Relics of saints were placed on his chest as he slept. He was the king of Spain, ruler of a once mighty empire, and still they treated him like a vessel for the devil. In a time before genetics, science, or psychiatric understanding, what could not be explained was attributed to the supernatural. But Charles's suffering had nothing to do with spells or hexes. It was biology. It was mitochondria and alleles, inherited errors repeated through generations. But to those around him, he was living evidence of divine punishment, or worse, a bad omen. Servants crossed themselves in his presence. Courtiers avoided his gaze. And in the quiet corners of the palace, people began to murmur, "How long can this go on?" Charles never fathered a child. He married twice, both times to noblewomen who were praised for their youth, their beauty, and their patience. His first wife, Marie Louise of Orleans, adored by many, died young and childless. Heartbroken and, some say, exhausted from the constant pressure to produce an heir from a man who could barely function as a husband. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, fared no better. She, too, left the marriage without issue, despite endless prayers, rituals, and even folk remedies forced upon them by desperate advisors. It was the final, bitter truth. The Habsburg line in Spain would end with Charles. There would be no heir, no next generation. The bloodline that had ruled vast swathes of Europe, that had counted emperors and kings, saints and conquerors, would die with a man who could not chew his food. In the end, Charles II was not just a victim of history, he was its consequence. His body, twisted and dysfunctional, was the physical embodiment of centuries of decisions made in candlelit chambers by men who believed blood was more sacred than biology. He did not choose his fate. He bore it. And behind the deformities, behind the whispers and rituals and misdiagnoses, there remained a simple, aching truth, that this king, like all of us, was just a soul trapped in a failing body, trying, in whatever way he could, to survive. Charles II of Spain was never truly alone, not in his gilded rooms, not at his feasts, not even in his suffering. He was surrounded always by people. Priests, advisors, attendants, ministers, cousins, foreign envoys, spies, but none of them were there for him. Not really. They came for power, for favor, for influence over a crown worn by a man who could barely hold a scepter. And while Charles's body was failing from the inside out, his kingdom was doing much the same. His court was not a place of order, but a theater of decay. Ministers whispered in shadows. Nobles plotted behind velvet curtains. Alliances shifted with the wind, and betrayal was never more than a conversation away. Spain, once the beating heart of the Catholic world, had become a dying empire, and nowhere was its sickness more obvious than in the halls of power. At the center of this crumbling machine stood a woman with far more authority than the king himself. Mariana of Austria, Charles's mother, and, genetically speaking, also his aunt. Mariana had been regent since Charles was a child, and even after he came of age, she never truly let go. She surrounded herself with allies, especially from her native Austria, and turned the Spanish court into a nest of favoritism and infighting. Anyone who opposed her influence found themselves exiled, silenced, or conveniently discredited. To say she manipulated her son would be too generous. Charles, isolated by his condition, raised in dependence and trained to obey, never stood a chance. He trusted his mother because he had no one else. She was his caretaker, his confidant, his political puppeteer. When he did try to assert his will, brief moments of resistance, it usually ended in chaos. His decisions were undone, reversed, or simply ignored. Power passed through his hands like water. He was king in title but not in function. Mariana was far from the only player in this cruel farce. The Catholic Church, always a looming presence in Spanish politics, saw in Charles both a liability and an opportunity. Bishops and confessors competed to influence him. They whispered of sin, of curses, of spiritual rot. His ailments were not medical, they claimed, but divine punishment. The solution: more prayer, more relics, more exorcisms. Charles was bathed in holy water so often he might as well have been trying to drown his chromosomes in it. Even the dead were consulted, literally. In one of the most infamous episodes of his reign, Charles authorized the exhumation of the corpse of his first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, hoping to discover whether she had been poisoned by enemies. Her rotted body was examined, her bones scrutinized, and a formal autopsy declared she had died of sorrow. This was the level of medicine in his court, guesswork wrapped in incense and paranoia. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, the empire was coming apart at the seams. Spain, which had once ruled territories stretching from Peru to the Philippines, was now bleeding from every corner. The treasury was empty. Trade routes were disrupted. Inflation, famine, and plague gripped the cities. Peasants starved while gold from the New World vanished into the pockets of corrupt officials and foreign creditors. The army was underpaid, the navy decaying. And still the court danced, as if the empire had not already fallen. Just silently, invisibly. France, under the iron rule of Louis XIV, looked on like a wolf circling a wounded animal. French agents swarmed the Spanish court, bribing officials, seducing courtiers, collecting secrets. They reported everything back to Versailles. The king's latest health crisis, the queen mother's intrigues, the struggle over the succession. Charles, too feeble to resist, became a pawn in the great game of European politics. His very body was the battlefield. Would Spain fall into French hands? Would Austria reclaim dominance? Who would inherit the corpse of the empire? Everyone wanted a piece of Spain, except, perhaps, the Spanish themselves, trapped in a system that rewarded obedience over innovation, faith over reform. They watched helplessly as their country slipped into irrelevance. The glory of Charles V and Philip II, the conquistadors, the armadas, the golden cathedrals, had become myth. And myths, like dynasties, can die if you cling to them too tightly. Charles was the embodiment of that clinging. He was not just the king of Spain, he was Spain. Fragile, incoherent, haunted, stuck between grandeur and collapse. His body, riddled with inherited defects, mirrored the empire's own genetic code. Too old, too proud, too stubborn to adapt. Ministers could not agree. Generals could not win. And the king could not produce an heir. The issue of succession hung over the court like a guillotine. With no children and no prospect of fathering one, Charles's death would mean the end of the Spanish Habsburg line. The question of who would replace him was not merely personal, it was geopolitical. War loomed. France pushed the Bourbon claim. Austria pushed its own bloodline. England and the Netherlands, anxious to preserve the balance of power, prepared for a fight. And Charles? He prayed. He wept. He signed papers he barely understood. In the last years of his life, he grew more paranoid, more withdrawn. He believed he was being poisoned. He feared his soul had been stolen. His body wasted away, teeth gone, hair falling out, eyes dull and sunken. He weighed barely 90 pounds, a man collapsing into the weight of history. When he died in 1700, at the age of 38, he left no heir, no legacy, only a war. The War of the Spanish Succession would rage for 13 years, engulfing Europe in bloodshed. But the true conflict, the one that mattered most, had already been lost. It was not fought with swords or treaties. It was fought in silence, in bedrooms and nurseries, over centuries of marriages that confused blood with destiny. It was fought in the genes of a boy born too early and too broken to ever rule, but forced to wear the crown all the same. So we are left with a question, hanging like smoke over the ruins of the Spanish court. Can an empire survive when its greatest claim to glory is a lie told by a dying bloodline? Can a kingdom built on inherited power endure if that inheritance becomes a curse? Charles II did not destroy Spain. He was only its reflection, a mirror warped, cracked, and terribly human, held up to the face of a world that believed it could outrun nature with titles, bloodlines, and crowns. They dressed him like a king, paraded him like a king, bowed before him like he was the divine extension of God on earth. But when the heavy doors of the royal chamber closed, Charles II of Spain was just a man with failing organs, trembling hands, and the weight of an empire collapsing into his bones. And in the quiet hours of night, beneath the candlelight and the murmurs of priests and physicians, a single truth remained. His greatest duty was not to govern, nor to wage war, but to produce a child, a son, an heir, a miracle, and that miracle never came. Charles II married twice. Not for love, no one expected that, but for the hope that somewhere in the brittle threads of European nobility, some surviving spark of fertility could be found, that perhaps, by joining his hallowed blood with that of another, something might bloom. But the soil was too poor. The harvest never came. His first wife, Marie-Louise d'Orleans, was the niece of Louis XIV of France, and by all accounts, one of the few lights in Charles's life. She was young, vivacious, fond of riding horses and dancing, and utterly unprepared for the world she was thrown into. Imagine being 15, ripped from the splendor of Versailles, and dropped into a somber, rigid Spanish court ruled by etiquette, superstition, and the ghost of Catholic severity. Add to that a husband who, despite all royal trappings, was more patient than partner, physically incapable, emotionally unavailable, spiritually worn. For 10 years they were married. 10 years of prayers, rumors, treatments, and disappointment. Court physicians blamed her. Ministers whispered she was barren. The church suggested she wasn't pious enough. Some claimed she had been cursed. Others that she refused the king's advances. But the truth was likely much simpler and far crueler. Charles could not consummate the marriage in any meaningful way. His physical deformities, endocrine issues, and neurological conditions made the act itself almost impossible. He was incapable of reproduction, yet still condemned to the expectation of it. Marie-Louise fell into despair. Her health deteriorated. Her appetite vanished. She became withdrawn, silent, ghostly. When she died suddenly at age 26, the court was quick to suspect poison, conspiracy, or some malevolent French hand. But her autopsy, a grim blend of pseudoscience and superstition, declared she had died of melancholy. In modern terms, heartbreak, depression, and likely an untreated illness worsened by emotional and political suffocation. Charles mourned her deeply. Some say she was the only person he ever truly loved. But mourning in monarchies is temporary, especially when dynasties are at stake. And so within a year, the search for a new bride began. This time, politics would lean toward Austria, toward Catholic solidarity, toward any lineage that might offer some sliver of fertility, however remote. Maria Anna of Neuburg was chosen, a German princess from a famously fertile family. Her mother had borne 23 children. Maria Anna was, if nothing else, hope wrapped in a wedding gown. She was strong-willed, shrewd, and fully aware of the stakes. From the moment she entered the Spanish court, she was given a singular mission: produce an heir or be branded a failure. But Charles was no less broken than before. No amount of sacred relics or elaborate medical treatments could undo what generations of inbreeding had done. Maria Anna quickly realized what she was up against. Her husband was barely functional, both physically and mentally. There would be no child, no heir, no miracle. And so, she did what many survivors do in impossible situations. She adapted. Maria Anna became a player in the brutal chess game of the Spanish court. She built alliances, forged loyalties, undermined her rivals, especially her mother-in-law Mariana of Austria, with whom she had a cold war of whispers and slights. If she could not be the mother of the next king, she would be the queen who controlled the present one. But still, the pressure to conceive never ceased. Every month was a liturgical cycle of hope and disappointment. She was watched. Her meals were monitored. Her weight was scrutinized. When she failed to show signs of pregnancy, rumors spread like wildfire. One tale, whispered with cruel glee among the nobility, claimed she had not produced a child, but rather had laid a demonic egg. That was how far Spain had descended. Science replaced by sorcery, politics laced with myth. Charles, increasingly paranoid and unwell, believed himself bewitched. He begged for exorcisms. He drank potions made of powdered gems and herbs soaked in virgin's blood. Nothing worked. Nothing could. He was the end, not just of a bloodline but of an entire worldview. Because what Charles represented, what his body carried to its final breath, was a philosophy that had ruled Europe for centuries. That power must remain in the family, that dynasties must be preserved at all costs, and that royal blood, even when rotten, was still divine. But that blood had betrayed them. Charles's inbreeding coefficient, a chilling 0.254, meant that over a quarter of his genetic material was identical, like the child of two full siblings. His family had married cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, over and over again in a desperate attempt to keep their empire pure. And in doing so, they bred not purity but fragility. His sterility wasn't just a medical issue. It was political doom. No heir meant no continuation. No continuation meant the vultures of Europe would circle, each with their own claim to the corpse of Spain. And so, as Charles sat on his throne, jaw protruding, eyes sunken, body withering, he bore not only the sickness of his own making, but the sickness of a continent that had confused blood for virtue. When he died in 1700, his will left the Spanish throne to Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon and grandson of Louis XIV. It was a final, desperate attempt to prevent total collapse. But it triggered exactly what everyone feared: the War of the Spanish Succession. 13 years of carnage, treaties, and shifting borders. The empire Charles had inherited, an empire his ancestors had built with gold, steel, and fire, was gone. Charles II was the last Habsburg king of Spain. But more than that, he was the last breath of an illusion. An illusion that divine right could override biology, that a crown could beat back entropy, that dynasties could survive on ritual and incest alone. In truth, Charles II never stood a chance. Not as a king, not as a man. He was born a symbol and he died a cautionary tale. A tale that still lingers, whispered in palaces and history books alike, of what happens when politics turns inward, eats its own young, and calls it tradition. He died in the dark. On the first day of November 1700, All Saints' Day, Charles II of Spain drew his final breath in the Royal Alcazar of Madrid. He was 38 years old. His body, broken since birth, had endured 4 decades of seizures, ulcers, fevers, hallucinations, and humiliations. His mind, shaped more by superstition than sovereignty, had faded long before his last breath. And yet, with that death came not peace, but the cracking of a centuries-old dam, long held together by the brittle mortar of dynastic ambition. He died childless. Of course he did. Spain had prayed, fasted, and pleaded with God for a miracle. Charles himself had written to the Pope. He had undergone countless exorcisms. He drank elixirs made of rhino horn and ground emeralds. He bathed in blood. Nothing worked. The line was dry, and with him, the Spanish branch of the once mighty House of Habsburg ended. Not with a glorious heir or a heroic last stand, but with the frail whisper of a man whose family tree had curled in upon itself until it strangled its own future. But death is not the end for kings. It is merely the beginning of another kind of horror. The moment Charles died, every great power in Europe moved to claim a piece of the carcass. His will, likely dictated by those around him in his final months, named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his successor. It was a final gamble. Rather than leave Spain to the Austrians, his own Habsburg cousins, Charles placed the fate of his empire in the hands of the Bourbons, the ancient rivals of his house. The logic was warped but strategic. Philip had a Spanish mother. He was young. France was powerful. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could hold the empire together. But Europe was never going to let that happen peacefully. The idea of uniting the crowns of France and Spain under one Bourbon dynasty was, to the rest of Europe, nothing short of apocalyptic. England, the Dutch Republic, the Austrian Habsburgs, and eventually even Portugal formed the Grand Alliance, an uneasy coalition hellbent on stopping France from becoming too powerful. And so began the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal, continent-wide conflict that would last over a decade. This was not just a war of thrones. It was a war of balance, of fear, of dynasties that had long played musical chairs with the blood of empires. Spain became the battleground not only of cannons and cavalry, but of ideology. Could an empire so rooted in inherited power survive its own rot? Could the world afford another century of kings who married their nieces in the name of God and country? The answer came in blood. From the marshes of Flanders to the hills of Italy, from the Pyrenees to the Caribbean, soldiers fought and died for a map that no longer matched the reality on the ground. Spain's empire, once the sunniest, most golden dream of global domination, was now a patchwork of rebellion, corruption, and decay. Her navy was in ruins. Her colonies in the Americas strained under neglect. Her once thriving cities were choked by debt and famine. The war ended in 1714 with the Treaty of Utrecht. Philip was allowed to remain King of Spain, but only after renouncing any claim to the French throne. The empire was divided. Spain lost its European holdings, Naples, Milan, the Spanish Netherlands, and ceded Gibraltar to the British. It was not a collapse, but a managed unraveling. Yet the damage had already been done. Charles's death did not just end a dynasty. It exposed the consequences of a system that had confused blood purity with political genius. For over 2 centuries, the Habsburgs of Spain had pursued one goal: keep power in the family. They had married their cousins, their nieces, their aunts. They had ignored the warnings of nature in favor of the cold calculus of inheritance. They had believed, with religious fervor, that divine right could conquer biology. But biology had the final word. Charles's entire life, his deformities, his infertility, his suffering was the final invoice of an empire that had refused to evolve. His body was the ledger of centuries of inbreeding, each joint and nerve and chromosome a signature from the past. And when he died, the bill came due, not just in the royal bedroom but across all of Europe. Historians have debated whether Charles's death directly caused the decline of Spain. But to those who lived through it, the connection was clear. The country that once claimed the Americas, that had stood against Protestantism and bankrolled the Catholic Church, had withered into irrelevance. It wasn't just military defeat or economic mismanagement. It was something deeper, more tragic. Spain had built a system that could not survive without Charles. And Charles was never built to survive. What followed was a century of fragmentation, decline, and desperation. The Spanish Bourbons, installed by treaty and war, tried to modernize what was left. But the myth had already died. The aura of Spanish supremacy, forged in the fires of conquest and held together by the blood of cousins, could not withstand the truth revealed in one man's body. Charles II was more than a failed king. He was a mirror, a reflection of the arrogance that had gripped Europe for generations. His reign was a slow, painful unraveling, a reminder that no amount of ritual, no cathedral of incense and Latin chant, no tapestry of titles and saints could protect a people from the consequences of their own design. He was born to rule but barely lived. His body a tomb, his dynasty a mausoleum. And when he died, he did not merely pass into history. He closed a chapter that Europe had written in blood and marriage contracts, a chapter that ended not with glory, but with a whisper. This is what happens when you crown a ghost. History remembers names. Kings, queens, conquerors. Etched into marble, recited in classrooms, glorified or vilified depending on the flag. But beneath those names, behind the crowns and cloaks and treaties, there are quieter forces at work. Forces no biographer can fully capture. Forces that don't march or speak, but inherit, mutate, decay, and sometimes destroy. Charles II of Spain was not a villain, nor was he a tragedy in the classical sense. He was not a cautionary tale carved by fate alone. He was, above all, a consequence, a breathing artifact of political obsession, the product of a dynasty that believed power was so sacred, so absolute, that even biology should kneel before it. But biology does not kneel. It waits, patiently, silently, and then one day it speaks, through a child who cannot speak, through a prince who cannot walk, through a king who cannot father a child, cannot hold his head straight, cannot hold an empire together. Charles's life was not a failure of character, but a failure of systems. A failure of logic so deeply embedded into the architecture of European monarchies that no one dared question it, until it was far too late. His suffering was personal, but its origins were political, generational, even theological. His death marked the end of a bloodline. Yes, but more than that. It marked the moment history was forced to reckon with a truth it had long ignored, that the thrones of men are built not only on iron and gold, but on flesh and cell and chromosome. We often imagine history as a story of great decisions. Wars launched, marriages arranged, alliances broken. But there are decisions we forget to count. Quiet decisions. Repeated marriages between cousins, not out of love or even lust, but out of fear. Fear of losing land, titles, legacy. Fear of others ruling what we claim by blood. And so the blood was kept close, too close, until it soured. Charles II was the last king of Spain from the Habsburg line, but he was also the most honest. Because in him, the consequences could no longer be hidden behind armor or ceremony. They were plain on his face, in his jaw, in his gait, in his inability to do what every king was expected to do, continue. And when that continuity failed, the world burned for over a decade to decide who would take the pieces. It is tempting to mock him, to reduce him to anecdotes. The bewitched king, the man who drooled, who stank, who couldn't eat or speak or father a child. But if we do that, we miss the point. Charles II is not merely a grotesque footnote. He is a reminder that history is not just written in ink and blood. It is written in code. DNA, alleles, mutations passed from royal bedchamber to royal bedchamber until they produce something no amount of money, no divine right, no army can fix. And so we are left with a question. A quiet, unsettling question. How many times in history did civilization crack not because of foreign invasion or revolution, but because of bad inheritance? How many empires died not in the field, but in the nursery? How many thrones were lost because someone long ago chose to marry power and not health? Perhaps history is not just the story of men and women who ruled. Perhaps it is also the story of bodies that failed, of lineages that could not hold, of dynasties that folded inward like dying stars, beautiful, brilliant, and doomed. In Charles II, we do not just see the fall of a man or even of a dynasty. We see the limits of legacy. And perhaps, if we listen closely enough, we hear the whisper of his broken voice asking us to look deeper, not at the crown, but at what lies beneath it.